my name's Will and I produce under the name Mistrust. I'm going to be going through the title track from my latest EP, which is out now on SGN Limited. It's called Forbidden. If you haven't heard it, make sure you go and check it out. But yeah, before we start, I'll just give you a little run through the track just to see what it's about. So yeah, that should give you a rough idea of what the track's about. It's kind of these quite tight but chopped up beats laid over a really sort of ambient background. Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so I think a suitable place to start is with the drums and the main percussion in the track. It's generally how I start all of my tracks. I just find it a lot easier to sort of mix in the bass and the synths after I've got all the levels and compression of the drums sort of right. Yeah, so I tend to consolidate the majority of my beat into this one channel at the top here. I just find it's a lot sort of it's less messy than having all the individual sounds sort of laid out. So like 2 kicks and 3 snares, it just gets really messy. So yeah, to start a beat, I always start with the kick, and I always have 2 layers for my kick. I have a kind of main body, the low end of the kick, which I compress a bit more, and then I've got a sort of punchier, sort of high end / sort of boxy bit of the kick, which acts as the transient. So this is my transient, which is quite a sort of organic sounding kick, and then this is the main body, and that's quite a sort of hard hitting electronic sounding kick. Yeah, and in terms of processing, all I've done for the main body is just give it a tiny little notch at around the 110 Hz mark, and then taken some of the bass out because it is quite a sort of strong sample, that, and it would just muddy up the mix with the bass. Yeah, and then in terms of compression, I've just used Pro C. The threshold isn't that low on it, but it's got a really high ratio, so all that's doing is just nicking off the top just to smooth out the transient a little bit. And then I'm just using transient master just to rein in the tail a little bit. And then for the sort of upper part of the kick, I've taken the bass out so it's not sort of competing for room with the other part of the kick. And then I've just identified a few treble areas in the mix and taken them out. Then I've given it a bit of stereo sort of information, because it was quite a flat mono sample originally, this part of the kick. So what I've done is put Guitar Rig's Psych delay on it, which is a really wide sounding delay, and I've just put the feedback to 0%, so there's only one echo occurring, and then the time at which that occurs is 13 milliseconds after the dry signal, so it's pretty much hitting instantaneously, and that just gives it a nice wide feel to it. And then obviously I don't want any of the lower end sounds of that to be in the sides, because that will really mess up the masters. So all I've done is just use the mid side splitter in Guitar Rig and put a sort of a shelving EQ to cut out the low end and in the sides. Yeah, and then lastly all I've done is just really pulled in the tail for this top end, because I just want it to be the sort of punchy hitting part of the kick. Yeah, and then for the snare I've got this sort of pitched up clap snare, which acts as the transient, so there's not much compression going on there. I've just taken the low end out. Then there's the main body, which again is just a pitched up sort of fat sounding electronic snare. And all I've done for processing on that is, again, identified a couple of treble areas, put a small room reverb on it using Realm by Native Instruments. That's a really, really nice reverb. I use it on a lot of stuff. It just sounds really natural. Yeah, and then again, similar to the body of my kick, the body of my snare is also sort of just getting the top nicked off a little bit. And then lastly, there's this kind of click. And you can see the transient is actually occurring just after when the others are hitting, because so they're instant, this is just afterwards, and that just kind of gives it a really subtle sort of grittiness, because there's kind of two little clicks happening pretty quickly after one another. And then what I've done for the fills is I've basically bounced all three of these snares together and then dragged in that bounce as a new file and pitched it up. Yeah, and then basically what I've done is I've lowered the volume of this first one, and that just helps give the beat some groove. If it was the same volume throughout, it would just sound quite flat and boring. But yeah, if it's sort of bouncing up and down, it kind of helps give it a bit of life. Then I just added some hats, some open hats. And that's just really to accentuate the downbeat with the kick, because there's this gap in the beat between the first kick and the first snare, and I really wanted to bring that out. So yeah, what I did is just kind of accentuate that downbeat with this open hi-hat. Yeah, in terms of processing on those, all I've done is panned one slightly to the left and one slightly to the right, and put some sort of, I've just taken the low end out, maybe a bit of boost on the highs. On this one I actually distorted it a little bit using Camel Crusher. I just think it helps give the hat a bit of warmth. And then just, again, a small room reverb using Realm. Then I've just got these two hats. Yep, they're just sort of, again, panned left and right. Then I've got this kind of quite constant 808 hat loop. And that's in mono. So what I did is I just mirrored that same pattern with a really stereo-y hat sample. And then all I've done with that sample is basically just use the stereo separation knob in the mixer, and that just helps sort of widen it a lot. And I've taken out loads of the low end on that, so it's literally just the top end sort of being quite wide, and then the 808 is more central. Then I've kind of given the whole beat a bit of groove using a chopped up break from the Music Radar D&B breaks pack. It's a free download of about 200 D&B breaks. It's essential in all of my tracks basically. Yeah, and I've just chopped that up. In terms of processing, all I've done is taken the low end out, tightened it up with Transient Master, and then I've used Maximus to do a bit of parallel compression. If you're not familiar with doing parallel compression with Maximus, it's quite useful for doing that. All you need to do is turn the high tab off and the low tab off, and just keep the mid on. and then basically this is acting as the compressor, so this is the threshold, this point here, and then this would be the ratio of your compressor. And in order to parallel compress something, so this is basically turning it off as a compressor, so that's just the dry signal at the moment, and then that's turning it fully on. Anywhere in between, you're mixing the uncompressed and the compressed signal. So I do that just to kind of take the tops down a little bit, but just to keep the sort of integrity of the dynamics of this break. Yeah, and then I've just widened it with some reverb and tightened it up with Transient Master again. Then I've just got a couple of little sort of hats just to kind of fill out that middle section of the 4-bar beat. Yeah, and then just to give the beat an overall sort of shiny top end, I've just given it a really simple shaker loop, and that just helps sort of glue the whole thing together, I think. Yeah, so that's kind of the beat itself. In terms of the way it progresses, so throughout the whole track, I've got these kind of weird texture bits of percussion. I mean, they started as percussion. Basically what I did was, for all of them, I used some sort of percussion or hi-hat sample and just put a massive grain delay on it. And then all I've done is recorded that grain delay sort of fading away, and then just reversed it. So it's kind of building up to when the hat initially hit. And it just gives a really cool texture to the beat, I think. It sounds almost like water. Yeah, and then just to sort of end the sort of every 16 bars, roughly, I tend to do it, not there. I use these delayed snares. I mean, all I'm doing there is recording the original snare, but with a delay on it. But I just make sure, because I'm dropping this file in whilst the original snare is already playing, this recorded snare needs to be fully wet, so that there's no sort of original snare signal in there that's going to be causing phasing issues with the snare here. But yeah, that just kind of helps signify the end of the 16-bar section. And then similarly, I've kind of chopped up this drum fill loop and just really messed around and distorted it. It sounds like this. Yeah, really glitchy. Yeah, and then I let the beat progress a bit. I bring in this shaker. And I've just smoothed that out with some subtle compression. And then I've got these kind of weird bits of percussion that I made. That's made out of a very sort of short spoken word sample that I've just basically done this with, and then put a little reverb on it. And then this one is just 2 rim shots that are pitched up and down. And all I've done for that is put a reverb on it and then compress it so that the dry signal is kind of squashed and the reverb tail is really brought out. Yeah, and then basically all I'm doing is making the beat get more and more manic as the first half of the track progresses. So what I do to do that is just start putting the kick in more and more sort of out of places. It kind of, previously it's been hitting once every 2 bars, now it's kind of hitting quite a lot. Yeah, and then basically I also double down on some of the snares, so I just do a second snare a little bit quieter there. Yeah, and I've also introduced these sort of faster hats. And that pattern's already been done by the Cabasa, but that's a softer bit of percussion, whereas this is kind of hard hitting, and I think that just kind of brings out the intensity of this beat. And then I have a couple of little edits in the beat, like as it stops here, I've just done a reverb of the main snare and then reversed it so it kind of falls away and immediately jumps back, and I think that sounds really nice. Yeah, and I also just bounced, I think it was a snare and a hat from the main beat. I recorded it and reversed it and then time stretched it absolutely loads and messed around with its pitch, just in the FL sampler, and it just came out quite cool. Just a really grim time stretched sound, and that works quite nicely as a little pause. Yeah, and then there's this bit of percussion as well, which I made by kind of smoothing out a cymbal crash, just using some volume automation just to make it sort of have a slow attack, and also reversed some triangle samples, and then I just put a load of reverb and delay on the two together, and it just creates this really nice sort of atmospheric sound that I use to sort of blend two sections together. Yeah, and then in the second drop, the beat pattern changes a little bit, but is relatively similar to the first drop. I'd say the main noticeable difference is that I introduce this kind of amen loop every 8 bars. And all I've done with that is just got one of the amen break samples from the Music Radar D&B pack and just filtered it in basically. And then with this one, I sort of messed around with the beat pattern a little bit and then gated it at the end, you can see there. Yeah. And one thing to note is that in terms of processing that amen sample, I've sidechained it to my snare. And that way you just don't have two snares hitting at the same time, because then you're just going to get really peaky beats. So yeah, it just makes sure that you've not got two quite transient heavy drums hitting at the same time. But then at the end of this phrase, I actually filter out the main beat, both using a low pass here and a high pass here on the main beat. And because that means that all my drums are getting quieter apart from my amen loop, it means the side chaining on the amen is still going even though you can't hear the main drums. So that sounded a bit out of place, so all I've done here is automated the side chaining compression from my main snare to the amen to just not compress it at all here, because they're no longer fighting for room and it sounded a bit weird. Whereas if I did that, it just, you can still hear the ducking if it's like that and it doesn't sound good. Yeah, and then I think the only other thing I could really mention is in the intro I've got this chopped up break, and all I've done with this is put a reverb on it, and the reverb is really strong. It's at about 70% wetness, yeah. So it sounds quite distant and gives it a lot of space. But then what I've done just before the track drops is basically brought that wet signal down completely to leave it pretty much completely dry. And I just think it has quite a cool effect of sort of sounding distant and then almost coming into the room with you. I think it's quite a cool effect, this. So yeah. Yeah, and then I think it's probably worth talking about how I bus my drums. So both of my kicks go into a kick bus, all of my snare layers go into the snare bus, and then all of my fills go into a fills bus, and then all three of those buses go into the master beat bus. So lots of busing, but it just means that I have a lot of control over what I'm processing, what I'm filtering. So on the kick and the snare bus, I'm just doing some subtle parallel compression using Maximus, just to smooth the tops out a little bit, but keep them relatively intact. And then on the same, on the master bus, I do the same. So I'm just kind of parallel compressing it a little bit. And that's again just smoothing out the tops of the kick and the snare, and also bringing up the fills a tiny bit. And then this is a really cool plugin that I've only discovered recently. It's called Coral Baxter, and basically all this is doing is just adding a sort of a boost to the real top end of the beat. It just kind of brings it to life, adds a sort of a bit of shine to it, I think. So without it, it sounds like this, and then with it, it's such a minuscule difference, but I think it makes all the difference, to be honest. Yeah, and then I've just got two filters, which obviously are being automated throughout the track. One high pass, one low pass. And then just to ensure that there's no nasty sort of feedback from those filters, any DC offset or anything, I've just got a 30 Hz cut and an 18K Hz cut, just to stop any DC offset, basically. Yeah, I think that's about it for the drums. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the bass in the track, and the bass in this is actually really simple. It just kind of rolls underneath the beat and the synths. Yeah, I didn't want to go too crazy with it just because the beat's kind of going a bit nuts towards the second half of the track, so I just kept it a bit simpler. So to introduce some of the low frequencies before the track actually drops, I used my Moog Sub Fatty here, and all I did was just recorded a really simple saw patch live and just brought up a really high resonance filter on it as the note progressed. And then all I've done in terms of processing it is just high passed it as it's building to the drop, and also low passed it to kind of just get rid of the raspy frequencies, and also put a chorus on it just to give it a bit of stereo width. Yeah, I really like the kind of raw sound of the filters on the Moog. It sounds really cool. Yeah, in terms of the main bass, it's just made up of two layers. I've just got a sub which I've made in Massive. Both of the layers are made in Massive. And all I've done to the sub really is put this envelope on pitch and sort of made it fall by an octave really, really quickly. And that just gives it a nice bit of attack, a bit of punch. And then for the upper layer, it's kind of a classic respace sound. It's a really thick sounding bass. And all I've done to do that is kind of got two oscillators. All three oscillators are on the sine square wavetable, but set pretty much to be sine. The top two you want with intensity down to the bottom, and both of them to be set at formant, whereas the third one to be set at spectrum. The one on spectrum you want at zero pitch, and the other two you want to sort of spread out like I have done there, and route these two to the top filter and this one to the bottom. And then if you just have a high pass filter set as it is there and a low pass there, then you're just going to get this really nice kind of wobbly, thick respace. It sounds really nice. I've just widened it a little bit with some subtle dimension expanding, and also by turning on the pan position and just sort of helping give it a bit of width. Yeah, and then I gave it a bit of motion just by putting this LFO on it. It's just a sinus shape, and just put it on all three of the oscillator amps just to help it wobble a little bit, and it's set to 3/16 speed. Yeah, and then the only other thing that I've done with both this bass and the sub is I have automated So I've set the macro control to the glide time so that I can choose when the note just starts on the note it's starting and when it's going to glide between the last note it played and the new note. Yeah, so you can kind of hear it here. I just kind of let it come in there. Whereas if I don't have it, yeah, it just helps kind of help the bass line flow a little bit. And then I've just got this, which is from Reactor's Monarch. I really like this this plugin. It's a sort of an analog emulator synth. It sounds really, really nice and warm. Yeah, and all I've done is just done two little sort of filtered stabs, put a bit of reverb on them, and layered them in over the sub. And then all I'm doing is sort of modulating this filter, or automating it, so that it's kind of constantly changing. And that just helps sort of keep a bit of motion and sort of carries the track on a little bit without sort of changing it too much. Yeah, and then the other two things I can talk about are these two edits. Yeah, and all I've done there is just kind of accentuated again the downbeat when the switch up occurs, and then the end of this 4-bar section to then lead into the next downbeat. They don't have much in the way of low end frequencies. They're just kind of letting the whole bass line kind of pop out and then sort of shrink back into where it was originally. And all I'm doing is just filtering both of them just to kind of give them a bit of motion. And I made both of these patches in Massive. They're just kind of a standard respace that I've really messed around with through quite a lot of processing. So both of them are falling in pitch. That's one of the things I would have done with it, is just made it fall in pitch. Yeah, to get this sidechain effect, you can see the bass is ducking there before sort of expanding a bit. All I've done is used the LFO tool by Exfer to get a kind of side chaining effect without actually having to side chain it to anything. Yeah, and then so all my basses are set out here, and they are all routed to my bass bus, and all the processing I'm doing there is just a bit of side EQ just to take any unwanted low end frequencies out of the sides, which will mess up the end master. And then what I've got is a high pass filter, which I have automated throughout the track here, just to kind of end phrases with. I like to have the bass kind of fading away. It just helps sort of give more impact for when the switch up happens, or just to kind of sort of round up a little phrase. But yeah, that's pretty much it on the bass. So for the pads in this track, I really wanted to kind of contrast the quite energetic beats and just have these really sort of ambient, relaxed pads just swelling in and out in the background. And to do that, I've actually used two different pad noises that I've made. And I just think using two gives you that extra bit of control. You know, you can filter one but not filter the other, and it just means you have that extra bit of control to sort of morph the sound of the pad as a whole. And the pad that I'm talking about is this one. Yeah, so if I just show you the different layers. Okay, so this is the upper part of my pad, which kind of swells in and out more frequently. and this is the lower part. Yeah, basically to make the first one, what I've done is I've used massive, I've made a patch, but none of the oscillators are actually turned on. Basically what I've done is used the noise amp and just introduced some brown noise with the color setting at the highest setting. And basically the tone of this patch is coming from the resonance in this filter. What I've done is just messed around with the cutoff frequency to find the point at which the cutoff, the resonance note matches the note that I'm playing on the pad. And so you kind of get a noise like this. Sounds quite messy because you get the sort of lower end of the brown noise messing around with it. I've also distorted it with some tube distortion and widened it with some reverb. But yeah, the real sort of change in the sound comes from Guitar Rig. It's a really powerful tool to sort of create pads, I think. And a good way to do this is just to sort of sift through, for pads, the reverb and delay section has a load of presets. And you can just find some really cool noises by doing that. You know, you don't have to settle on how it sounds like that. You can tweak it, you can add more components, but I find it's quite a good starting place just to kind of get a few ideas for what kind of sound I'd want. So this one, there's quite a lot of it going on, but I started with a preset called Granular Sparkle and kind of changed parts from there, and it kind of morphed it into this. And then if I EQ it, so we're starting to get quite close to the sound that I want, but I didn't want this sort of long attack or really sort of long tail to kind of mess around with when I want to change the notes. So what I did is I recorded it into Edison, and then in doing that I just loaded it up into Contact, into the sampler, and basically just looped it, bringing the X fade up to kind of loop it really smoothly. And that just means it's a playable chord basically, and it kind of gives it that old school vibe where you're just playing a chord in a sampler. I just think it's a really nice sound. And then similarly for the lower part of the pad, which kind of fills it out a lot more, that's made using an upright piano from Contact. Yeah, and basically what I've done here is written out a really basic pattern. I didn't want to do block chords because obviously the sound will be more intense when the chord's hitting and then it'll tail away. What I wanted to do was have notes pretty much playing constantly throughout this pattern to kind of give the pad a more constant feel. And obviously you can kind of mess around with the velocity of the notes to kind of give it a bit of motion. Yeah, and again, Guitar Rig is where I've gone to give it the sort of main paddiness. Basically all I've done is thrown a bit of spring reverb on it, messed around with it with a grain delay, and then I've introduced the reso chord, which is a really cool little effect. You can either have it set to chord where it will make a chord of your choosing, or you can just have it to one note, which is what I've done, and I've done it, set it to E because the chord I'm playing is E minor. So with that on, it sounds like this. So that just adds a bit of sort of grittiness to the low end. And then to really turn it into a pad, I've just put a huge reverb on it, basically, with the mix set all the way to the top, almost. Yeah, and then in the same way that I did with the brown noise pad. I've just recorded it, thrown it into Contact, and looped it again with the crossfade settings quite high so that it just blends really nicely from the end of the sample when it starts looping. Yeah, and it just gives it that kind of old school feel. But yeah, as I say, I'm kind of automating the low pass filters on both of them, just so that it can kind of change in tone. You just have a lot of control over how the pad as a whole sounds if you're controlling two different elements of it. The only other thing to talk about really is on the brown noise pad. I have used isotope vinyl, and that's just to give it some subtle pitch warping, just to kind of give it that old vinyl effect. And then the same, I've put the setting, the year setting to 1970. That just gives it a slight tinniness. I think that adds a bit of character to it. And then I've just sidechained both of those pads quite heavily to the kick and also to the snare, but with the snare it was not quite as in your face. The next thing to talk about would be the vocal pad that I made. That's using like a little vocal sample, or two little vocal samples from a pack, but they were only like 2 seconds long, the original samples. What I've done with them is used this plugin. It's an external thing called Paul Stretch. It's a free download. It's quite old-fashioned looking. Basically, it's just a really nice time stretching algorithm, and I've turned what was like a 2-second vocal clip and stretched it by about 1000%, and turned it into a really long clip, and that sounds like this. Yeah, it just adds this really nice ethereal feel to the pads, I think. And then I've kind of brought in a gator as the note is sustained. I slowly automate a gator on it, and that's just using Xfir's LFO tool. You can see I bring this up here. Yeah, so that just kind of adds this, the gator adds this nice sort of glitchy feel to it, I think. And then as the track progresses, especially in the second drop, I start messing around with the panning of that vocal stretched sample. I just pan it from left to right and then back again. It just kind of keeps a bit of motion in the sound. Yeah. So I've got this sort of, I think it's a Chinese bamboo flute sample that I got from an Asian Instruments sample pack of Flute Masters. And I've basically just chopped out 3 different bits that I quite liked the sound of, and put them in into a position that sounded really good. Yeah, and there's not too much in the way of processing on this. I've just put a big old reverb on it, identified a couple of areas that needed fixing, and then just done a bit of parallel compression just to smooth it out a little bit, and then some harsher compression just to smooth out these 2 peaks because they were getting a bit loud. Kind of playing off the gated vocal, I also have this gated string. That's literally just using the stock Fruity Loops string instrument that you can just play. And all I've done is just bent the pitch whilst it's playing and also automated a gator on it. So yeah, to kind of play on this Asian theme that I have going on, I introduced this harp. It's really subtle. I don't know, it adds a little something. So for the switch up in the first drop, I introduced this sort of arpeggio, which I wrote in a Monarch, again, which is what I used for the sort of stabby noise in the bass line. And once I've introduced this arpeggio, I kind of get rid of the main pads for the first time in the track. But yeah, basically I've just written out this arpeggio, this ascending arpeggio in the secura scale. And in order to sort of make the noise of the synth morph as the track develops, I've just automated the cutoff point on the filter in Reactor, and just brought that up, and then kind of I start messing with it a bit more in the second 16 bars that it's there. Yeah, basically I bounced it to audio as well because I've put a big delay on it, the psych delay again from Guitar Rig, and I didn't want the tail of the delays kind of bleeding into the next section, so all I've done is bounced it to audio and just cut that tail off to keep it a bit cleaner. But in terms of processing on this, what I've done is I've obviously taken the deep end out of it, and then I've used the Solid Dynamics plugin just to compress it a little bit, because obviously it's quite a spiky waveform, so I didn't want it, I wanted the peaks to be reduced basically, and just to bring the whole sound up a bit. Then I've side chained it to the snare and the kick as well. And then what I've done is I've used the Fruity Stereo Shaper. Basically, if you sidechain the channel that you're using it on to another one, and then use the preset mid A side splitter, what it does is it sends any information that's in the sides to that channel that it's sidechained to, and then only the stuff in mono in the center will stay in this channel. So if I play this on its own, this is just going to be the side information. Yeah, and that's so I've just taken out the low end of the sides, but then also having sent the side information to this channel, I then reintroduce a bit of side information using the Waves plugin, Brow Motion Stereo, and that just kind of sort of uses panning positioning to kind of morph the sound, and all it's doing is adding a real subtle sort of movement to the mid information in this arpeggio. I think it sounds, you can just hear it very quickly sort of ducking from side to side. I think that sounds quite interesting. Yeah, and then in the breakdown I introduce this little melody. That's just using one of the stock pads from Contact, I think. They've got a great selection of pads in there, and all I've done is just put a big reverb and delay on it, and kind of brought the levels up as it starts. And then to kind of make this transition into the quite abrupt sort of changing chord in the breakdown, I've kind of accentuated it with a really reverberant piano hit. It's just one note, and I think there's some sort of pitched delays on there as well. And then all I've done to kind of build into that is just chopped a little bit of that reverb out and faded it in backwards. So it sounds like this. Yeah, and that just helps sort of bring out the that change in key. Yeah, and then in terms of processing on all of the pads together, all I've done is taken out the low end in the sides using Pro Q, and then I've just got a high pass filter which I have automated. Yeah, so it's this bit here, and all I'm doing with that is just so you know, when it's sort of building up to a certain section, I get rid of the low frequencies, and that just helps sort of give the next section a bit more impact. And likewise for sort of winding down a section, I want to kind of get rid of the low frequencies. But yeah, that's about it on the pads. So the last thing to talk about really in the track is textures and effects. And I think they're just really, really important to help sort of blend sections together and sort of add a bit of motion to the rest of the noises that are going on. Yeah, and I've sort of layered up quite a lot of different textures in here. So the first one I've done here is actually just a finger snap, which again I've used that pull stretch plugin on to time stretch it by about 800%, I think it was, and then it ended up like this. Yeah, it's quite a sort of a soothing sound. Then next what I've got is this. Really nasty sound on its own. And I actually, the sound originated as just a phone recording of an underground train coming into a station. And all I've done with that is just really messed around with it and put a load of distortion and delays on it to give it some stereo width. Because obviously on a phone it's just going to be coming out in mono. And yeah, that's basically it. It sounds really horrible on its own, but kind of layered in with everything else, it finds a bit of context, I think. And then similarly, I've kind of layered it in with this other texture, which is a little bit deeper and less gritty, and has a lot more motion in it. And this is just taken straight from the Native Instruments Battery 4 library. Most of the stuff in Battery 4 is sort of one-shots for beat machines and stuff. But yeah, it's also got some quite interesting samples and soundscapes, and this is one of them. Yeah, I really like the way that's kind of rising and falling. It just adds a bit of motion to this other layer. So together they sound like this. Okay, and that brings me on to this next sound, which is this, which I have a lot of different sort of versions of this, which I make for my tracks. It's quite a fun bit of sound design to do. Yeah, I'll show you how I do that. It's really straightforward. Basically, all you do is load up an empty contact sampler. I'll just draw a long old note. Yeah, and then basically what you want to do is, so I'm currently in my sort of drum hits folders, and one of the things I do a lot with it is use rim shots, but I also like using stuff like hi-hats and kicks. Let's use that one. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is just loop it. So now when you play it, it's going to be doing that, and then the lower you play it, obviously the slower the loop's going to be, and the higher will be the other way around. And you can just mess around with it like that and just sort of automate the pitch, and it will speed up on its own as the pitch is increasing. But to have a little bit more control over it, I changed the time stretching thing to time machine, and that just means you have control over both the tune and speed independently of one another. So if I go ahead and assign some automation and then make a couple of automation clips. Yeah, and then basically all you need to do is just mess around with it and see what works. It's quite nice to have it not just rising on its, like, not both of them just rising, but kind of play around with sort of one rising and the other one starting to fall again. So already that's sounding quite nice. But the way I tend to sort of give it a lot of space is again using guitar rig. You know, you can throw something like a grain delay on it and just mess around with stuff. And very often I'll like to automate the parameters within guitar rig as well. So like as the sound is coming to an end, I'll sort of put a massive reverb on it or put more delay on it so it just tails off a bit better. Yeah, and then something like, I often do a couple of side delays and just have different settings. Yeah, that's basically how I do those sounds. Quite straightforward to make, but they just add a lot in terms of sort of having quite a lot of motion without really noticing it that much, because they're kind of sat in the background of the mix. But it just adds a little something. And then similarly to blend a section from one to the next, I've got this sound which is again just the first 3 beats of a drum loop that I've time stretched using pull stretch. Yeah, and that just helps add a little ambience. This one is kind of similar to what I've done with the wood block over here. I've just got a little vocal clip. It's actually from like a recording of one of my mates, and I've just chopped a tiny bit of the voice out, sort of messed around with the pitch. I think I've duplicated it so one's playing lower than the other in pitch, recorded that, distorted it, recorded it, and then thrown it into Contact again and looped it and done basically the same thing with it, so pitching it up and down and messing with the speed. Yeah, and that just adds a really sort of weird texture. So in context it sounds like this. Yeah, and then I've got this sound which I use in quite a few of my projects actually. It's kind of morphed over the years. And it actually started out as this from a different track that I did years and years ago. Yeah, so all it's doing is it's like some sort of saw wave instrument, probably massive, and I'm just bringing up the cutoff of the filter as it's progressing, and also introducing a lot more reverb. Yeah, and then basically to make it into that weird little sort of fading sound, I've just massively sped it up. So yeah, I like messing with sort of time stretching. And then yeah, in the breakdown I kind of introduced this new texture here, and that's just again a really time stretched sample of some sort of jungle ambience. Sounds kind of spooky on its own. But that just adds a little something to this sort of switch up in the breakdown. And I'm just automating the volume here. Yeah, that's basically it on the textures, and to be honest on the whole track. I hope you've found it helpful in some way, and that you've enjoyed it. But yeah, if you've got any questions, leave it in the comments and I will answer it as best as I can. But yeah, cheers.